Baker Botts, LLP, provides podcasts for educational purposes only. They are not legal advice and are not intended to establish an attorney client relationship. This communication may constitute attorney advertising.
Welcome to AI Counsel Code. The AI Counsel Code is here to keep you up to date on all AI legal issues arising in the modern business frontier. I'm your host, Maggie Welsh, and today we're diving into a topic that a lot of companies are dealing with right now, using AI in employment decision making. I'm joined by Scott Nelson, who's a partner at Baker Botts. Scott, thanks for being with us today, and why don't you introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Maggie. It's a pleasure to be on our program. So I just joined the firm in February 1st, 2024. So I've only been here a little more than 9 months, but love it here so far. My specialty is labor and employment law. And so with that, I get to advise a lot of America's top companies on their employee issues. Also get to defend them in court when employees sue. And I handle all sorts of interesting matters related to employees, even corporate transactional and agreements and international employment matters. So I really handle it all when it comes to employees.
Great. And we're happy to have you here today to talk about your expertise in AI and employers using AI in the decision-making process for employment. So let's start off with a baseline question. In your experience, how many employers are using AI to make decisions regarding their employees? And is that something that you've seen uptick in recent years with the rise of generative AI? Or has that really been something that employers have been doing for a long time, maybe not using generative AI models, but just the base AI models?
So it's funny you ask that question because every time I give a presentation on employment use of AI, I'll to a group of executives. I've done this a few times now, and I've gotten some semblance of the same question. One of the executives at the end will say, hey, this is all super interesting, but we're not really using this. And then inevitably, someone in HR, one of their HR execs will raise a hand rather sheepishly and say something like, actually, we're already using it and we've been using it for some time. I think a lot of companies have been using it. They don't know they've been using it, but they've actually been using it for years. So as you know, AI really hit the mainstream just a couple of years ago in 2022, when we all heard about ChatGPT. That was the public conversation. It was very exciting at the time. But even if you look back to 2021, the year before this was really in the public discourse, there was a Harvard Business School report. And at that time, they said 99% of the Fortune 500 companies are using AI in employment decision-making. And 75% of all companies, this is all the way from mom and pop shops up to the Fortune 500, 75% of all companies were using it as of 2021. Before ChatGPT became a big deal. And that's really, so this was the company's gateway drug to AI, if you will. Really the way it's defined in use of employment is it's algorithmic decision-making used to make employment decisions. That's the way the EEOC defines it. But so they've been doing this in a number of different ways, and it's really only on the increase. There's a recent study, a survey by Eightfold AI. It says 92% of HR managers plan on increasing their use of AI in the various areas of employment decision-making in the next few years.
Huh, that's interesting. The number already seems so high, but it seems like it's going to increase even more than that. So, how are companies using AI in the employment decision making process?
Right. And so the way it's going to increase, to answer the first part of your question, is it just into different areas. I think everyone started off using it in recruiting, and recruiting is really the big one. And here's why. There's a couple different drivers there, but let me just give you some examples. There's a New York investment bank that I worked with, and they'll remain nameless, but it's one of those investment banks where everyone wants to work there. So they would get upwards of 25,000 applications for one of those plum positions. And imagine the army of people they had to have to sift through that and figure out, okay, who do we really want? And then they had to interview a bunch of those folks. And it was incredibly time consuming and expensive to recruit someone. So what AI has done in this algorithmic decision making to find talent, that same investment bank now they use AI to narrow it down to two candidates, and those two candidates get an interview, and one of those is going to get the job. So that radically cuts the expense and also the time to hire for companies like that. It's also led to a cottage industry a bit, though. You've probably seen these experts online. They will optimize your resume for $2,000 or $3,000 so that you can get a particular job. And I've seen those. You can see a really clunky resume that doesn't look that great to the human eye, looks really good to the machine eye, though. And I've actually seen a discrimination case related to this, where you had one person who had a really good-looking resume from a human standpoint, and it was obviously seemed to be better qualified than the person with the clunky optimized resume. But the person with the clunky optimized resume got in and got the job. So there is a bit of gaming the system going on, and that's even going to increase because there's another movement among Silicon Valley companies in particular. They don't want to hire college grads. And you think about it, Bill Gates didn't graduate from college. It's a different mentality, and you'll talk to them about it. And I remember talking to some Stanford grads about this, and they were like, hey, Stanford's a great school. We loved Stanford. We went to Stanford. Lots of smart people come out of there. But the problem with Stanford is no matter how good they are, they're 2 years behind us. The folks that go there, they're going to spend, a lot of money on school, a lot of time, and they're going to graduate. Sure, they'd make a little bit more money than someone who doesn't have a college degree, but we're going to have to get them to unlearn what they know and relearn our system and then start getting ahead. Wouldn't it be better if we just had software figure out through just different types of testing and aptitude testing and intelligence testing and things like that to figure out someone who really is a good fit for this type of work? We bring them in, they're smart, they're hungry, they work for 4 years, they're making money instead of incurring student debt. And then by the time that 4 years are up, they're making a multiple in income of what someone who's getting out of college would make. So there is a movement actually in the recruiting space to eliminate the college degree and to go to having AI figure out who the best candidates are. But I think this has really gone beyond recruiting too. Companies are using AI for real-time performance management. You can imagine if you have a call center and you're trying to look at people's productivity and how long they're spending on calls and how effective they are with the people. AI can analyze that in real time and give you a really good idea of how your people are doing so you can optimize your talent, you can give appropriate feedback and things like that. One company that I've also worked with, this is interesting, some companies are using AI for promotion decisions as well. But this one company, they're a company of engineers, also a well-known company, they have every employment decision, promotion decision, from entry-level hire all the way up to CEO is made by AI. So I think that's a little spooky. At least it would be spooky for me. I mean, they love it because there's no biases, whatever in the process. It's just a computer figuring it out. To me, that would be spooky because do people really know you? It's just this black box. It's essentially deciding your career ascendancy. And actually, it's also deciding who's selected for layoffs. And companies are using this to select who's in a layoff. So the use of AI in employment decision-making as AI gets better, and you can do things like include video interviews, you can include speech analysis, things like that with employees. The way performance reviews are handled, promotion decisions, hiring decisions, AI is going to be a really big part of that. It has been already, but it's increasing.
Fascinating. And as a lawyer like yourself, a lot of what we do is risk management and figuring out where the risks are. And just hearing your stories about all the ways that employers are using AI, it's making me very nervous from a risk management standpoint. And you hear the headlines where there are problems that employers have encountered when using AI in the decision making process. There are stories of bias creeping into those decisions. So, what problems are there with using AI with employment decision making? What have you seen in that regard?
You're very astute to ask that question because a lot of times I'll get the opposite question asked when I'm, giving one of these presentations. I'll say, how could a machine possibly discriminate against someone? And they just don't understand. They think if it's a computer, that it couldn't have a bad bias or discrimination because they're like, only humans do that. That's not true. AI has the same problem as really all computer programs do, and that's the garbage in, garbage out phenomenon. Because someone's programming this at some level, or it's learning from a particular data set, or whatever that is, it's not necessarily perfect. And whoever the designer might consciously or unconsciously incorporate various biases in the programming to get certain results. But really, let me give you an example. I think this is probably the easiest way to look at it. And this would be seemingly innocuous and innocent. Let's say you're a recruiter for a company that has a plant, like a manufacturing plant in a particular location. And given the nature of that plant, you want your employees to be able to be called to work in a hurry if you need them there. So you decide, all right, I'm just going to look for applicants in the zip code of that particular facility's location. Now, let me ask you this, and I've seen this happen before. This is called proxy discrimination. If you have the demographic of that particular zip code, I'll ask the question to you, Maggie. How likely do you think it is that that demographic will match exactly the demographic of the applicant pool at large?
Probably not likely.
Right. That's exactly right. So if it doesn't match, you've got a discrimination issue. Because if the applicant pool is made up of all these different demographics, but if the demographics of that particular zip code are different, then statistically it's going to look like you're discriminating. And in fact, you may be discriminating from a disparate impact standpoint. So there's a lot of thought has to go in. This isn't simple like a calculator. These programs are vastly complex, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong. There can be errors here and there, and just things that aren't thought of. So they really need to be statistically validated, and we can probably talk about that in a little bit to make sure that they're not discriminatory.
And can you explain a little bit more how AI can unlawfully discriminate against an employee?
Sure. So what it's called is disparate impact discrimination. And that's different than discrimination most of us think of. When most of us think of discrimination, we think of what's called disparate treatment discrimination, which just means that intentionally, a person is intentionally choosing one person over another or giving the one person over another different treatment based on a protected class or protected characteristic. That's what commonly people think of as discrimination. And that's the most common kind. Disparate impact is different. Disparate impact is when you have a neutral on its face policy or procedure, or for example, in the case of that zip code, just a neutral thing. The operator who plugged in that zip code probably wasn't thinking of discriminating against him. It just wasn't thinking about it. But you have a neutral policy or procedure in effect that has a disparate statistical result on the population and the applicant pool. So that's really what we're looking for. And it's a difficult concept for a lot of people because it's not intentional. The discrimination does not have to be intentional. It's just simply whatever's going on with your AI program, is it creating statistical results that in effect discriminate against different groups?
Okay, I see. And so to regulate this use and to try to come up with some ways to mitigate the bias and the discrimination, I know the federal government has tried to prevent using AI for automated decision making in certain instances. Can you talk about some of the guidance from the federal government?
Sure. The EEOC actually got on the ball pretty quickly with this. And I think it's really been not just federal, but state. It's been a regulatory land grab with AI. Everyone wants to have some regulation on AI. So this is a very popular thing right now. The laws are changing rapidly. But at the federal level, the EEOC in January of 2023, and just thinking about the timing, ChatGPT came out, I believe it was around November of 2022 that it was actually introduced to the public. So now we're at January 2023. So this is pretty fast for a government agency to move. They issued their strategic guidance for their plan, their strategic enforcement plan, which is over the next 4 years. They listed their number one priority is preventing discrimination in hiring and recruitment through AI. So that was their big announcement, their big shot across the bow that we're going to be looking at this. But then in May, just in May of 2023, just a few months after that, they issued guidance regarding use of AI in employers' selection processes, really anything from hiring to promotion to termination. And they, of course, talked about that disparate impact discrimination that I just talked about. But then they went back to, and they said, hey, we've actually been regulating stuff like this for a long time. Because they said, really, anything that's, as they call it, an algorithmic decision making tool is something that we would regulate for this disparate impact discrimination. So they actually went back to guidance they had back in the 1970s, back when there were a lot more typewriters and certainly there were computers. And they pulled out this, it's called the 4/5 rule, which basically means if you have a program like this, an algorithmic decision-making tool, that it affects two different groups or two different protected classes differently. As long as the difference, like let's say there's a positive effect of it, as long as the group that's completely positive, let's say they're at 100% of what benefit they get from this, the other group is not disadvantaged more than at the 80% level, or that's the 4/5 rule. That sort of as a rule of thumb, they're like, this is just probably statistical noise. We're not going to see anything that there's a problem there. The reality is that's just a rule of thumb. And I mean, statistics, when you get into large numbers, that 4/5 rule may not even make sense. But that's just their rule of thumb when they're looking at for enforcement purposes. If they have to start somewhere, I guess. That's what they're going to look at is if it treats a group less than 80% as well as another group, then we think you've got a disparate impact problem. So the other interesting thing, though, that the EEOC did, because a lot of companies using AI, for example, recruiting or really for any of these decisions, is they were relying on the third-party software vendor, or they would have an agreement with them just saying, hey, who's at fault here, really? And the EEOC said, no, actually, employer, we don't care about your agreement with a third-party vendor. You're responsible for this. So you actually have to look at this, or they didn't say you had to. They strongly encouraged you to statistically validate your software and then adjust it if it's problematic or get rid of it and get something different. So you have a system in there that doesn't create this disparate impact discrimination.
So putting the responsibility really on the employers to make sure that it's not being discriminatory.
Exactly. You can point the finger at the software vendor, but it's not going to get you anywhere.
So that's the federal level. You mentioned states. What have you been seeing at the state level?
There's a lot of activity at the state level, and I'm sure way more than we could cover today. At least 28 states have enacted some type of laws that affect the use of AI in employment decision making. Maybe I'll just give you a couple of my favorite examples just because I think they're some of the most interesting. One is the Illinois AI Video Interview Act. This is interesting, but I was giving a presentation on this, and one of the HR ladies in the audience raised her hand and said, hey, this just happened to me. I just went through one of these interviews. So there's video interviewing by AI for selection. And this gets back to, I remember I said that you can have an army of people trying to figure out this huge funnel of applicants, and you got to interview some people and narrow it down to the perfect, candidate at the end. What the companies were doing that Illinois saw fit to regulate was they would, and they're still doing it, obviously, they're interviewing people. So you'd be on like a Zoom call or a Teams call. There would be a virtual person on the other end of that call. So it would look like a person is talking to you. You would be talking to that person, that virtual person, not a real person. It's really just an AI program. And that person would be doing a few things, not just asking you questions and interacting with you, but through the camera and through the microphone would be analyzing, for example, your speech patterns, the vocabulary you use, what's the level of this person's ability to talk to people. The video camera would be looking at your posture. Are you smiling? Things like that. So from an AI perspective, and this is pretty advanced, but basically they're the first round interviewers, just like a lower level HR or recruiting person would be for that initial interview. AI is really replacing that for these video interviews. And the person I talked to who just went through it, she said it was a very kind of spooky and surreal process to just be talking to this virtual person and hoping you impress this virtual person to get advanced in the job. So anyway, so Illinois, what they said, because apparently this did unnerve some other people, is they said, so if you're going to do this type of interview, you have to notify the applicants in advance. You have to get their affirmative consent for this type of interview. And also, they said that companies that rely on these practices, these video interviews, they have to actually gather and report race and ethnicity data for the applicants who are hired and rejected so they can look at that statistically and see if there's a discrimination issue. That's the Illinois. New York came out with a big one, and I think this is going to be a template for a number of the states. It's called the New York Automated Employment Decision Tools Act. And basically, that's for any companies that rely on AI, machine learning, other computational models for their employment decisions. They have to submit their software to an independent bias audit before it can be implemented. And they also have to publish the results of that audit online. So that actually creates a cottage industry for lawyers like me because companies want to do those audits on a privilege basis. So they'll call me, I will set up a privileged audit. I'll get a statistician and a labor economist typically involved from other companies that I work with, other outside experts, and we'll do a statistical audit. And usually there's a tech person who understands the software, and we'll see if this actually passes muster from a discrimination standpoint, or do they need to tweak it, fix it before they implement it and publish those results. I think a lot of folks in New York probably aren't complying with that because pretty much everyone is using this, getting back to the Harvard study, but not a lot of folks have published their results yet. So I think people are just sort of waiting and seeing before the big first enforcement effort related to that comes out. And when it does, and I think that's going to grab people's attention. But I think a number of companies are also trying to get ahead of that. But also in New York, you have to disclose to the applicants before an interview whether a tool like that's going to be used and what data will be collected. New York has got a pretty strong model, and I think a number of other states are going to follow suit.
Interesting. And you touch on a lot of points that I think are useful for not just for employers, but employees too, looking for jobs, looking at a video interview and what to be thinking about in terms of your resume and thinking about an AI model reviewing your resume. So, something that everyone should be thinking about how this is changing the way we apply for jobs and the way we hire employees. So let's get practical for our listeners who might be faced with this issue as an employer. You talked about the great benefits that AI can have in sifting through applications. So, how should employers be using AI? What should they be thinking about if they're using AI in their employment decision making?
I think for employers, one of the big things, actually, I'll give you probably several different tips here. One of the big things, as you can see, the federal and state laws are rapidly evolving. If you're using this in your employment decision making, and you are, given the statistics, you probably are, you want someone keeping up with the law. Because, for example, if you're in New York, you didn't realize you had to comply with that law I just mentioned, or if you're in Illinois doing video interviews, you need to know these things. And these laws are changing quickly. So someone needs to be on top of the law within your organization. Also, you need a person over your AI programs who understands both the legal and the statistical nuances of that disparate impact discrimination. I help folks with that on the outside, but like I say, it's a team effort because you've got statisticians, labor economists, other people who work with the lawyers on that. I would always I would maintain human involvement, I think is really important just to make sure that there's no disparate impact discrimination. I mean, there's a lot of ways this can go awry and people's futures are on the line. So it's a pretty important thing. And I think you want to recruit the best people. You may not want that person with a clunky resume. You want the person who's the most qualified. I guess the flip of it, a little advice for the people seeking jobs out there, definitely get your resume optimized. But I would make sure it also looks good to both the human eye and the machine eye, because that'll get you past that second, third round, things like that to actually, for sure, hopefully get you the job. But really, I think companies should consider conducting those privilege audits. I was talking about the AI assisted selection procedures, because they really need to heed the EEOC's admonition that if there's a problem, you either need to fix it or get new software, because eventually the EEOC or someone's going to come after you if you don't. Another thing employers should really think about, and there's separate EEOC guidance on this that we didn't talk about, but you have to make sure if you're using these tools that there's accessibility for disabled people, that they're able to, for example, do the video interview or whatever it is you're doing using these algorithmic decision-making tools. You have to make sure folks with disabilities have access to it. But I think the big thing is designate a responsible person. You don't want diffusion of responsibility in this because it's easy to point the finger or blame the software company or whatever, but you guys are responsible. So You want a responsible person to keep their hand on the wheel.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Thanks for your insights on this topic, a topic that I know a lot of employers are dealing with. So, appreciate you coming on the podcast. And thank you again to our listeners for listening to AI Council Code. We're so glad that you joined us today. Stay tuned for additional podcasts and more insights on AI legal issues.
Thank you for listening to this Baker Bots podcast. Baker Bots has the experience, knowledge, and people to address our clients' most significant legal issues. For more information on Baker Bots practices, please visit us at bakerbots.com. This presentation is provided by Baker Bots LLP for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship. Under the rules of certain jurisdictions, this communication may constitute attorney advertising.